My aim in the next 15 minutes or so is to review the background of Home Rule from the late 19th century, and then focus on those crisis years between 1910 and 1921 in particular, which saw, of course, the Home Rule crisis, the Easter Rising, the Somme, and of course, ultimately the Partition of Ireland by 1922. So we take the first slide, please, Robert. Thank you very much. Just moving, yeah, absolutely. The thing to remember is, of course, that Ireland had its own parliament until the year 1800, when the Act of Union, of course, became operative on the 1st of January 1801, abolishing the old ascendancy-dominated Irish Parliament, which had been there really from Norman times, but particularly had a long period between the Boyne, 1691, and the Act of Union. And of course, this was the old Parliament in Dublin and College Green. And nationalist aspirations from Daniel O'Connell's day onwards were to see the restoration of a Parliament in charge of Irish affairs within the kind of the broad polity of the British Empire. That was the view of constitutional nationalism. The next slide, please. And this slide, of course, this movement, of course, gained momentum in the 1830s when Daniel O'Connell, of course, achieved Catholic emancipation. And Daniel O'Connell, very much the father of constitutional nationalism, sought the repeal of the Union, the restoration of an Irish Parliament. But of course, by the 1830s, 1840s, when he was pursuing this ideal, at Westminster, at monster meetings throughout the countryside, of course. By that stage, Ireland was polarising. And of course, the Protestants of Ireland were generally beginning to move away from the idea of Ireland a nation during this period. The next slide, please, Robert. And of course, it was in 1870 that an Ulster Protestant barrister, Isaac Butt, a son of the rectory in County Donegal, established what he called the Home Government Association. Butt was a liberal barrister. He was more of a liberal than a nationalist, having defended a number of physical force activists in the Fenian movement in the late 1860s. Butt became convinced that some kind of Irish Parliament was essential to prevent revolution. And so he envisaged, if you like, a limited parliament under the British Crown, with major matters still being decided at Westminster. And he believed that people like himself, members of the Irish Protestant minority, and especially the landed classes, would be represented in such a parliament. But of course was eventually eclipsed by this man, Charles Stewart Parnell, a Protestant landowner from County Wicklow. And it was Parnell, really, who actually, as Gladstone put it, put Home Rule on its legs in the early 1880s, creating a modern political party, the Irish Parliamentary Party, and by 1885, 86, holding the balance of power at Westminster. And it was Parnell, really, who persuaded William Gladstone, the first Liberal Prime Minister, who said his mission was to pacify Ireland in these years. He persuaded Gladstone to introduce a home rule measure for all Ireland, the first Home Rule Bill of 1886. The next slide, please. And of course, it was that Home Rule Bill introduced by Gladstone in 1886, and eventually, of course, splitting his own party. It was rejected by the House of Commons. It was that Home Rule Bill that began this so-called Liberal Alliance, whereby Irish nationalist MPs relied on the British Liberal Party, whether under Gladstone in the 1880s and 90s or Herbert Henry Asquith after 1912, to introduce a full measure of Irish Home Rule. Gladstone tried again in 1893 to pass a second Home Rule Bill. This time it got through the Commons, but it was rejected by the House of Lords, which at that time had a permanent veto against legislation. It was Tory dominated. Things would change, of course, going forward into the 19th century. But Home Rule, of course, sent alarm bells ringing in Unionist Ireland, especially in Ulster. We'll see the next slide, please. And this period saw the kind of emergence of a unionist movement in Ireland. In the north, it was very much based on the lodges of the Orange Order. Their processions captured here in 1935 by the Belfast artist John Lavery, the famous painting of the 12th imported on. And the Orange Order really a cross-class organisation drawing together the different, if you like, Protestant denomination, became the grassroots scaffolding of unionism. Originally, there were two wings of Irish unionism. You had the broader aristocratic-based unionism of the South, represented by people like Lord Lansdowne and the aristocracy. And then you had Ulster unionism, which was very much an amalgam of the gentry, the strong farmers, and the rural and urban middle classes, as well as, of course, the urban proletariat. And of course, this movement emerges from 1886 on, eclipsing that movement within Presbyterianism, which had supported the liberals. Most Protestant liberals become liberal unionists and eventually are assimilated into Ulster unionism later on. The next slide, please. And of course, while unionism is reorganizing, nationalism undergoes a decade of civil war in the 1890s. This is caused by the downfall of Charles Stewart Parnell after the divorce scandal involving his affair with Catherine O'Shea. Nationalism is split into Parnellites, anti-Parnellites after Parnell's death in 1891, and it's not until 1900, following the celebration of the centenary of the 1798 insurrection, that Irish Home Rule nationalism coalesces around a Parnellite figure, the rising figure of John Redmond, an upper-class Irishman whose father was an MP, who was a barrister who attended Trinity College with Edward Carson. And of course, John Redmond was a very moderate nationalist. His outlook was summed up in a speech he made in 1902 when he declared, "Let us have home rule and imperial strength." He was not just a home ruler, he was a British imperialist. He had begun his life as a clerk in the House of Commons, managing its business. And this meant, of course, that he regarded British parliamentary democracy as the zenith, really, of democratic expression. So Redmond and Carson, his great antagonist after 1912, shared a lot in common, as well as a camaraderie from the Dublin forecourts. They both believed in the empire, they both believed in parliamentary democracy, but of course they had very different views on Irish Home Rule. Redmond's deputy was the son of the young Islander, John Dillon, who was the son of John Blake Dillon, the young Islander from the 1840s. And the third man in the Home Rule leadership was the small man on Redmond's left there in the picture. Redmond is to the, if you're looking at the picture, he's to the left of the lady. And then you have Joe Devlin, a small man, dapper dresser, the pocket Demosthenes, he was known as. Born in West Belfast in 1871, he was considerably younger than the senior leaders of the party. He was a great organizer, a brass-throated orator, and of course he had organised nationalism in the province of Ulster around a semi-secret political religious organisation called the Ancient Order of Hibernians, the AOH, or the Molly Maguires as they were nicknamed, which had grown up really in the 1890s as the counterweight to the Orange Society. And by the late 19th century, Hibernianism existed in the shadows in counties like Tyrone and Cavan. But Devlin relaunched it in 1902 and harnessed it with its marches, with its sashes, with its political platforms to the Home Rule Party, which, of course, at that stage had a considerable number, a minority admittedly, of 10 or 12 Protestant Home Rule MPs at this period as well. And the aim of the Home Rule leaders, of course, was the establishment of a devolved parliament for Ireland, which would have charge of laws for peace, order and good government. The commanding heights, of course, finance, taxation, war and peace, the crown, they would still rest with Westminster, whereby, of course, British troops would still remain at the Curragh camp in County Kildare and at Thiepval barracks in Lisburn. because this was more or less what we have today at Stormont. It wasn't, I mean, a kind of proto independent Irish Parliament at that stage. And of course, Redmond is in many ways a beneficiary of these years of turmoil in British politics. If you pause for a minute and think about this, in 1905, there was a Liberal landslide in Britain. The Liberals returned in a campaign based really on the cheap loaf. They're led by a number of people, but by 1910, they're led by Herbert Asquith, who's a liberal imperialist, who's a liberal reformer, who isn't very interested in Ireland. But the problem is, of course, the Conservatives had set their path by the anti-Home Rule campaign of 1886. The Tories made Ireland the touchstone of British politics. They saw Home Rule for Ireland as a slippery slope that would eventually see not just the independence of Ireland, but the breakup of the British Empire. And there was also the emotive slogan in these years of Irish Protestants in danger. And of course, all of this meant that conservatism found a powerful leader in Andrew Bonar Law by 1911. Bonar Law was the nearest thing we have to an Ulster-born conservative leader. He would later, of course, hold the premiership for a few months before his death in 1923, becoming known as the unknown Prime Minister. But in these critical years, 1912 to 1914, Bonar Law, if you like, throws the massive weight of British conservatism, the men of the shires, the officers of the British Army, people like Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, behind Ulster Unionism in its campaign against Home Rule. Now, of course, the Liberals are finding the going getting rough by 1910. They lose 2 general elections in that year, which produce a hung parliament. Similar numbers, 270 odd Liberals, 270 odd Tories, and of course, the Irish Unionists, particularly the Ulstermen, are part of that Tory bloc. Enter John Redmond. He signed a pact with Herbert Asquith, whereby the Nationalists would support Liberal reforms. The Liberals were the party of old age pensions and education acts in return for Home Rule for all Ireland. And so the third Home Rule Bill, unforeseen at the beginning of the 20th century, was tabled by Asquith in a 15-minute speech in April 1912. Given the support of the Liberals, the 30 or so Labour MPs, and the Irish Nationalists, 80 MPs, Home Rule was bound to become law by 1914. Why? Because Asquith had taken the precaution of drawing the teeth of the Tory House of Lords. The Parliament Act of 1911 had removed the Lords' permanent veto, giving it merely a delaying veto. And so it could only delay Home Rule for 2 years. So Ulster Unionism, of course, began to organise and saw the campaign against Home Rule as very much one that would come from outside Parliament in these critical years before the First World War. The next slide, please. And this man becomes a key figure. And of course, he becomes eventually Prime Minister of a new sub-state called Northern Ireland in 1921. James Craig, of course, very different figure from Carson. He was the son of a wealthy distiller. He was born in East Belfast in a plain Victorian mansion, now falling into disquietude, really, because it fails to get funding as a single identity building. The house where Carson and Craig reviewed the UVF back in the heady days of 1913 and 1914. James Craig wasn't a brilliant man, but he was very astute. He had learned a lot at his father's boardroom table. His father was the chairman of Dunville's distillery, the Royal Irish Whiskey Distillery in West Belfast. And of course, his father was a self-made man, started off as a whiskey salesman, ended up chairman of the board, was able to settle £100,000 on his son James when James became 21. James Craig was educated at Merchanson School in Edinburgh. He always had a clipped Ulster accent. You know, we are king's men, he would say, in the late 1930s as the Second World War erupted. But of course, He was then apprenticed to a stockbroking business in London, wasn't very interested in business. And when the Boer War broke out in South Africa at the turn of the 20th century, Craig was commissioned as a captain in the Royal Irish Rifles. He saw action in South Africa, but he also showed a flair for meticulous organisation. He was in charge of railway timetables. It sounds like watching paint dry, really, but he would bring these administrative skills to bear in those critical years, 1912 to 14, in both, if you like, organising the Ulster League and Covenant in 1912 and the rise of Carson's army in 1913. The one thing about Craig was, of course, after the Boer War, he found it difficult to settle down, and he thought he would follow his brother Charles Curtis Craig, already an MP, into politics. He was unsuccessful on his first outing in Fermanagh in 1903. But Craig realised that there were divisions within Ulster Protestantism. He was defeated by a land reform candidate in Fermanagh who got the votes of Methodists and Catholics. And Craig suddenly realised that unless he reorganised unionism, which was very much in the dead hands of the gentry, they were going to lose the urban working classes and the tenant farmers potentially to home rule, or at least to create a position which would allow home rule to take place. Craig was finally elected for East Down in 1906. A bad election for a unionist to be elected. It saw the Liberal landslide. But he was a poor public speaker. The historian Jonathan Barton has famously said that James Craig was signally uncharismatic. I hear you say we have many politicians at Stormont who might fall into that category. But of course, you had to be a great orator in those days. You had to be a Carson or a Devlin or a Lloyd George to captivate the masses. And he realised that the best unionist speaker in the House of Commons, among those kind of 270 Tories, was the lawyer with the Dublin accent, Sir Edward Carson, a Dubliner, the son of a modest architect in Dublin, whose really worldview had been shaped by his aristocratic mother, Isabella Lambert. Carson, very different to Craig. He's the tall, lanky lawyer with the jutting jaw, the kind of brilliant command of oratory, the great forensic skill. He would be a perfect foil to, of course, Craig, who was described as having in his Westminster orations a dreary drip of words. Let's see the next slide, please. And here we have Covenant Day, 28th of September 1912. It was Craig in a London club who had a chance discussion with a Belfast unionist businessman who suggested a covenant to bind together the Protestants of the north of Ireland against the threat of home rule, harking back to the Scottish covenants of the 16th and early 17th centuries. The Irish historian Joseph Lee has famously said that a covenant was the Presbyterian way of reminding God whose side he was on. Nonetheless, it stated the case against home rule, the religious case, that home rule would place the religious and political rights of Ulster Protestants in danger, the risk to the North's industries. Belfast built on that great tripod of linen, shipbuilding and engineering, hardwired, of course, to that great free trade area, the British Empire. But finally, and most importantly, the Ulster Covenant reserved the right of its signatories to invoke the use of force if a Home Rule Parliament was imposed on the Protestant North. And this, of course, set a precedent for the 1916 Republican Proclamation and for the Sinn Fein Manifesto of 1918. And here we have Carson, the Dublin lawyer, signing the Covenant. But let's go back to Carson for a moment. He was very different to James Craig. He had been born in Dublin in 1854, educated at Arlington School in the Irish Midlands, in a so-called French Huguenot village where his friends came from the aristocracy and the ranks of the legal profession. But the greatest influence on him was his mother, Isabella Lambert. The Lamberts were settled in Galway, County Galway, as Cromwellian soldiers. And in his childhood and adolescence, he visited their plain Victorian mansion at Castle Ellen, outside the town of Athenry. It's there that the young Ned Carson heard Irish spoken by his grandfather's tenants, saw hurling being played. He played a similar game, hurley, at Trinity, which was allied to the Scottish game shinty. He was aware of a rich tapestry to Irish life in the south. And while he knew the road to Galway, and as a young barrister, he knew the road to Munster and throughout Leinster, he didn't really know the north until 1910, 1911, when he was recruited by James Craig. But Carson's aim all along was to keep the whole of Ireland, including his own people in Dublin and Galway, enfolded in the Union Jack. He wanted to maintain Ireland as an entity within the United Kingdom and avoid Home Rule completely. And he hoped to use Ulster as a weapon with its Protestant majority, not large, 56% in the whole province, its industrial might. He hoped to use that as a barrier against Home Rule. And Carson very cleverly and loyally talked about Ulster as though it was solidly and homogeneously Protestant during the heady campaign against Home Rule. Behind him are the members of the newly declared Ulster Provisional Government. Carson said they would seize power in those areas in which we are a majority. Now, of course, Craig was prepared to go along that all-Ireland road under the Union Jack. But if the going got rough, of course, Craig had already envisioned the idea of creating a homeland, almost Israeli-like, a homeland for his own people in the northeast corner of Ireland, not necessarily the historic nine-county province. And at the end, Carson would find victory slipping from his grasp. And at the end, by 1914, 1916, Carson was trying to get the best deal he could for his Unionist clients. The next slide, please. Now, of course, just to remind us, we've talked about Protestant home rulers. The best known, I suppose, in the past was Parnell, but you also had the Reverend Isaac Nelson. Everything in the Shankill Road seems to be called after him, Nelson Square, and the Nelson Place, the Nelson Memorial Church. And the Reverend Isaac Nelson, a liberal Presbyterian, was Home Rule MP for Mayo in the 1880s. This man, Richard McGhee, was a Protestant from Lurgan. He was the co-founder of the National Union of Dock Labourers in Britain. This man is a hero in Liverpool and Glasgow, almost forgotten in the north of Ireland. And of course, he was twice a Unionist he was twice a Protestant Home Rule MP for Louth and then for Tyrone down to 1918. So just reminding us that there was this minority of several thousand home rulers on the Protestant side, led, I suppose, by Lord Perry, the shipbuilder, who had their own covenant in favour of home rule rather than against it. But of course, nearly 500,000 Protestants signed the Ulster Solemn Covenant against home rule in 1912. The next slide, please. And almost inexorably, of course, the clock was being wound up by Carson, a man who was a very complex figure. Carson was a man of moods. From childhood, he was haunted by neurotic anxiety. Doctors today would say he suffered from manic depression. After the great public speeches, the great performances in the House of Commons, where he would play like a virtuoso on his audience, he would more or less dissolve into deep depression. And eventually, of course, Craig and them realised he would get his second wife. His first wife died tragically in 1913 at the height of the Home Rule crisis. And he married a younger woman, and she would be helping him to write letters to Craig saying, "I am doomed." This was from his alleged deathbed. "You must continue." But eventually the Unionists realised he would be okay, Ned Carson, if he kept taking the tablets. And the road lasted inexorably to the rise of the Ulster Volunteers. By January 1913, kind of citizens' army on the lines of the volunteers of the 1780s who had been raised to defend the Irish shores. A new volunteer force emerged, drilling in the shipyards, in the estates of friendly landowners and orange halls, often with shotguns or just dummy rifles. But of course, all of that changes in 1914, when Major Fred Crawford, an eccentric Belfast businessman, an ardent Unionist, got Carson's permission to embark on a cloak and dagger mission to Hamburg His aim was to purchase 35,000 German rifles and 3 million rounds of ammunition. They were run into the port of Larne in April 1914 and distributed in a massive military-style operation to Unionists across the 9 counties of Ulster. I mean, hundreds went to arm the 5,000 volunteers in County Cavan alone, led by Sir Oliver Nugent at this time. But of course, this didn't happen in a vacuum. As the historian Michael Laughlin wrote, I'm sure 40 years ago, unwittingly perhaps, Carson, by raising the volunteers and arming them, an odd thing for a lawyer, Carson had reignited the Fenian flame of revolutionary nationalism. Watching in the wings was the reviving force of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which had been reviving in Belfast and Dublin in the years before 1916. Their slogan, of course, was England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. When England was in the Great War, which was being predicted as the alliance systems cranked into place by 1914, they, of course, wanted a strike force for their rising, which they hoped to plan during the war. And so, of course, they urged an Ulsterman, an Ulster academic called Owen McNeill, to launch a counter-movement, the Irish Volunteers. McNeill had actually organised a meeting in Dublin in 1914 and launched the Volunteers. His slogan was "The North Began." He wrote an article in the Gaelic League Journal on Clive Sullish at the end of 1913, praising Carson and the UVF. He went to Cork City with Roger Casement, now a nationalist, to recruit members of the Irish Volunteers. And he called for 3 cheers for Carson. Very dangerous, because he didn't get 3 cheers. He got 3 chairs thrown at the platform. And McNeill, who definitely had put his money where his mouth was, a bit naive perhaps, had to be rescued by Casement. But the Irish Volunteers spread. Let's see the next slide, please. A rare picture coming up of the Irish Volunteers being reviewed on the Falls Road at the end of 1913. Most of these men would follow John Redmond's call to join in the rush to the colours in the First World War of 1914. A small section of the volunteers of the whole of Ireland, maybe 10,000, broke away and gravitated under McNeill's leadership to the IRB. They would be the strike force for the Irish Rebellion of Easter 1916. But most of these men were constitutional nationalists, the great body of them. And of course, I should say something else. When John Redmond spoke in Cork or West Belfast in this period, he spoke under 2 flags. He spoke under the Union Jack, symbolising the Empire, and the green flag with the harp. When Winston Churchill came to the Falls Road in February 1912 to make a speech in favour of Home Rule, he praised the people of the Falls Road for the grand profusion of Union Jacks, which greeted him as he made his way up to the road. So this is a very, very different age. The Union Jack had not yet really been arrogated by any particular party. But you now have 2 volunteer forces. At Westminster, there is immense tension over Home Rule. The Liberal government are facing massive resistance from the Unionists and their Conservative allies. Bonar Law tells a Unionist meeting in England he can imagine no lengths of resistance to which Ulster is prepared to go, in which the Conservative Party would not be prepared to support them. And this meant the support of people like Lord Kitchener and Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson. So by 1914, the UVF, with its massive arms, had won the military race for proficiency. Smaller than the Irish Volunteers, but much better armed and much better trained. By the summer of 1914, the Liberals' compromise idea of county option, which would have produced maybe a 4-county or 3.5-county northeast corner outside Home Rule, that had been rejected by Carson. He wanted a permanent arrangement, notionally for the 9 counties, but failing that for 6 counties. And of course, it looked as though the volunteer forces were going to collide in a move which could see the outbreak of civil war. The king called a conference at Buckingham Palace in the last days of peace on the 24th of July, 1914. The king was George V, the man who has a major influence in the Irish question and its de-escalation during this decade. Carson, Redmond, Asquith and Bonar Law met around the table, pored over maps. But of course, as Churchill put it, the Buckingham Palace conference that summer became bogged down in the muddy byways of Fermanagh and Tyrone. Their dreary steeples would define this conflict for a long time to come. And just as Ireland seemed on the brink of civil war, the Great War broke out in Europe, and Redmond and Carson shook hands for the sake of the old days on the circuit, urging their rival volunteers to go wherever the firing line extended. Carson told his men to fight for Ulster and the Empire. Redmond told his volunteers to fight for Ireland and the freedom of small nations. The Great War got underway. The next slide, please. The Great War was marked, of course, if we move to the next slide, thank you very much, by the placing of the Home Rule Bill on the statute for all Ireland. But Asquith made it clear it would not be activated until the war was over. And secondly, there would have to be some special treatment for Ulster. In other words, this Home Rule Bill might have been outlined for all Ireland, but it was going to be amended after the war. Well, the war, of course, would last for the next 4 years. And of course, the war raised hopes of that revolutionary leadership in Dublin and in Irish America for a rebellion. So Roger Casement was sent to Germany to obtain guns and men. He didn't get the men, he got 20,000 rifles. He decided to try to stop the rising, which he thought would be futile. But of course, he was arrested. The guns were scuttled by the Germans outside the mouth of Cork Harbour, and the rising went ahead in confusion, narrowed to Dublin effectively in Easter 1916. 400 died, but of course, General Sir John Maxwell, the GOC, was given plenipotentiary powers to crush the insurrection in Ireland, and he was to set up court-martials, which resulted in the execution of 15 of the leaders and principal insurgents. Now, of course, that was to change public opinion, and Ireland united in support of the war, by and large, north-south, with Irishmen fighting in Carson's 36th Ulster Division in the north, and Redmond's 16th Irish Division, the so-called Irish Brigade, from north and south. Suddenly, of course, the rising broke out, and public opinion in nationalist Ireland began to drain away from John Redmond. Connolly summed it up in a socialist Republican newspaper. "Full steam ahead," John Redmond said, "and everything is well, chum. Home rule will come when we are dead and buried out in Belgium." It was in the wake of the rising, and this groundswell of support for the surviving rebel leaders, people like Eamon de Valera and Countess Markievicz, now imprisoned in England, that Lloyd George, the Minister of Munitions, a rising star in the wartime coalition government, proposed a compromise to the Irish question. 6 counties, the present 6 counties of Northern Ireland, will be hived off, and the rest of Ireland will be given immediate home rule. Redmond accepted this as a temporary measure, but Carson was given a written assurance that it would be temporary. Separate meetings were held in separate halls in Belfast. Carson effectively ditched the Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal Unionists. It had to be done, he said, if America was to be brought into the war and the empire was to be saved. At a meeting in St Mary's Hall, Belfast, on a day called Black Friday, 23rd of June 1916, Redmond, Dillon and Devlin urged 800 Northern nationalists to accept temporary exclusion. The nationalists were split. Redmond threatened to resign. And in the end, of course, a majority favoured the scheme. But the Southern Unionists, Carson's own people, and he was the MP for Dublin University, they rebelled under Lord Lansdowne and Walter Long, both former major Southern Unionist leaders. The Southern Unionists said, what about us? We're 12% outside Ulster. We are going to be abandoned to a nationalist-dominated Home Rule Ireland. They got the support of the Tory backbenchers. The scheme collapsed. Redmond was fatally damaged, even before the events that led up to the 1918 election. Carson was also damaged. His judgment was at stake here. Craig was becoming a more important force, and Lloyd George had gained his first, detailed experience of the Irish question, which would stand him in good stead during the period of partition later on. The next slide, please. Carson, of course, realized that the writing was on the wall for his own people in the south. He was being attacked, for example, by Archbishop John Henry Bernard, the Archbishop of Dublin, who attacked Carson as a Dublin MP who was advocating the partition of Ireland and the abandonment of his own people. So inexorably, Carson moved north to stand in the 1918 election after the armistice, the last All-Ireland election before partition. Carson moved from Dublin University to a working class seat in North Belfast, Duncairn. He actually hired Mount Vernon, a fine Victorian house, for 2 months during his campaign. This was to be his last election campaign. He didn't enjoy it. He was heckled by industrial workers from the Shankill and Tigers Bay who were demanding the 44-hour week. This wasn't the wine and cheese party he was used to in his days as a Dublin University MP. But of course, his movement north symbolised something else. He was symbolising effectively his acceptance of the partition of Ireland, his acceptance of defeat in his own terms, though he would lament the partition of Ireland to his dying day. The next slide, please. The next slide, please. And of course, a key figure campaigning in the north at this period is Eamon de Valera, the former mathematics teacher born in New York to a Cuban-Spanish father and an Irish mother. De Valera was reared in a labourer's cottage in County Limerick, but he was a bright scholarship boy. He was the senior surviving commandant of the Rising. We can discuss that later. Here he's pictured with Seamus Heaney's wife's people, the Devlins, who were wealthy fishermen, had a business there at Arboe, County Tyrone, during a by-election in East Tyrone in 1918. So here you have De Valera and some of the Sinn Fein leadership, as well as the Devlin family of County Tyrone. De Valera, of course, would famously stand in 3 Irish seats, including Belfast Falls, in the 1918 election. He would be defeated by wee Joe Devlin, who had been the rising star in the days of early Home Rule promise. But Devlin was the darling of the mill girls. De Valera was an outsider. He was defeated by almost 2-1 in a rather rowdy election in Belfast Falls. A kind of, if you like, rebuke that De Valera never quite forgave. The next slide, please. And of course, the MP for South Tyrone, William Coote, would actually pursue De Valera in America, leading a deputation of Protestant clergymen during De Valera's tour in 1920. The next slide, please. And of course, this is the key map, the last All-Ireland election. That belt of seats in North East and Mid-Ulster had been there from 1885, 1886. But this time, the Unionist clout, if you like, was enhanced because the Reform Act of 1918 had extended the number of seats in British and Irish cities. Belfast went from 4 seats, of which 1 was Unionist in 1910, to 10 seats, of which 1 was Nationalist. Sorry, I should have said 4 seats, of which 3 were Unionist in 1910, to 10 seats, of which 9 were Unionist in 1918. So Craig was beginning to think in terms of filling out the blanks and demanding the 6-county cut of 1916. The pale green seats, of course, reflect Cardinal Logue's intervention in the 1918 election. The head of the Catholic Church in Ireland was urged to enter the fray and prevent a split vote on the nationalist side. So we brought together De Valera and Joe Devlin, and a number of seats were known as packed seats, and they were actually saved for the Home Rule Party. Devlin led a small party of half a dozen in the House of Commons, the only kind of nationalist presence, but he was dwarfed by the 23 Ulster Unionists. And of course, the important thing about that election was that Lloyd George, now Prime Minister, a Liberal, and Bonar Law, the co-Prime Minister, the Conservative leader, led a largely Tory coalition And in their manifesto, they gave Ulster Unionists an assurance that the 6 counties of northeast Ulster would not be subjected to an Irish Parliament against their will. That enabled Craig and Carson to support the coalition, and it enabled Craig and 2 of his colleagues to become junior ministers. Now remember, James Craig is now sure-footed in the corridors of power. He was Parliamentary Secretary of the Admiralty. He was able to shape the unfolding partition scheme and, of course, enhance the security of the Protestant North during the Anglo-Irish War. The next slide, please. And here, of course, is the important thing. Sinn Fein contested the 1918 election on a Republican platform. Not only that, but they rejected Westminster, adopted a policy of abstentionism, and set up Dáil Eireann, the Parliament of Ireland, from the Irish, with its MPs, no longer MPs, but TDs, Ceacht the Dáil, members of the Dáil. In that first meeting of Dáil Eireann on the 21st of January 1919, when a republic was declared and a cabinet was created, headed by Eamon de Valera as president, he soon became known popularly as President of the Republic. Michael Collins as Minister of Finance, other ministers, Countess Markievicz as Minister of Labour. Most of the TDs were in jail. Most of the leading people, like de Valera in Lewes Jail in England, like Michael Collins in Frongok, like Countess Markievicz, they were not there. And so it would be a few months before they were released. One man who was very worried, though, about the declaration of the Republic was Ernest Blythe, a Protestant member of the Dáil from Lisburn. He represented County Monaghan. He came from an Orange background at Mahargal outside Lisburn. And from his cell in Crumlin Road Jail, he expressed horror that the Republic was declared, because as a Northerner, Blythe believed that the real issue was now averting partition, which seemed almost inevitable, and that the Republic was a will-o'-the-wisp, which would lead to a split and ultimately a civil war in the south. The next slide, please. And on the day the first Dáil met, of course, the first shots rang out in the Irish War of Independence in County Tipperary. 2 policemen were shot dead by local volunteers, and that guerrilla war would continue to spiral. The British government responding to the collapse of the mainly Catholic police force, the Royal Irish Constabulary, by bringing in ex-soldiers being demobbed from the Western Front, people who became known as the Black and Tans, and then the more elite officer corps, the auxiliaries. They were recruited in 1920. The British government also introduced a policy of direct reprisals for IRA activities. Initially, the burning of creameries, eventually the taking of life, so that by the end of 1920, Ireland was in a state of bloody and extending warfare, with IRA actions extending north. Northern nationalism, of course, was divided by the events of 1916, especially Redmond's acceptance of exclusion. A major Sinn Fein figure in Ulster was this man, Donegal-born Cahir Healy, who had come to Enniskillen as a journalist in the 1890s and became a major figure in the Irish Republican Brotherhood and the rising Sinn Fein party. He would eventually retire from Stormont as Father of the House in 1966. The next slide, please. Next slide, please. And of course, events in the south impacted in the north in so many ways. This is the funeral at Kilskerry in County Fermanagh of Alan Lendrum. He was a resident magistrate from Fermanagh, from a landed family, who was shot dead by the IRA in Clare. His funeral, of course, escorted by the Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers, acknowledging his war service. Events like this, of course, were to see an escalation of sectarian tensions in Ulster. You have IRA attacks in barracks. And then, of course, you have events in the south impacting directly on the north. The assassination, for example, of the Lord Mayor of Cork, the Sinn Féin Mayor Thomas McCurtain, led to an inquest jury finding against District Inspector Ross Oswald Swansea. Swansea was an Ulster RIC man. He was moved to Lisburn for his own safety. He was tracked down and assassinated there in the summer of 1920 on Michael Collins's orders. And then you have the Lisburn pogrom. If I could read the account of Fred Crawford, the gunrunner, who was by that stage helping to form the Beast Specials. And he says, I took a dare up to Lisburn to see the state it was in. The town was burning, all the Catholic businesses had been laid waste. And he wrote, it reminded me of a French town after it had been bombed by the Germans, as I saw in France in 1916. We visited the ruins of the priest's house on Chapel Hill. It was burnt or gutted. This was the eruption of serious sectarian violence in the north, which would rage for the next 2 years. It was the constant backcloth to the creation of Northern Ireland. The next slide, please. And that's bringing us up to the next slide, because a key figure in all of this was James Craig. James Craig, of course, who, of course, wanted to shape the partition scheme. It wasn't until October 1919 that the British government established a committee to consider the Irish question. By this stage, just back one, I think, by this stage, the map of Europe was being redrawn by the big three, including David Lloyd George. Just come back to Lloyd George if we can, please, Robert. And of course, the Long Committee decided on partition as a solution, 2 Irish parliaments with limited powers, one for Southern Ireland in Dublin, one for Northern Ireland in Belfast. But Sir Walter Long, the chairman of the committee, a Conservative MP, also favoured a 9-county Northern Ireland, that the North should follow historic Ulster. Liberals on the committee, and this was a coalition government, argued that Irish unity was in Britain's national interest, and that a large Catholic minority in the 9 counties of 44%, if you include counties like Donegal, would lead to Irish unity sooner rather than later. The 2 parts of Ireland would be linked by a council. You can see Irish Council written on the hat, a Council of Ireland, which would initially have control of railways and fisheries, but could expand into an all-Ireland parliament. That was the plan. But of course, one man who wanted to thwart that plan was James Craig himself, because of course, James Craig wanted a permanent solution to the partition of Ireland. And learning about the Long Committee's decision for 9 counties, he intervened. And if we read the committee minutes, he intervened on the 13th of November 1913. Craig said that he didn't want the entire province. 6 counties were preferable, and I quote the minutes, the reason given was that Protestant representation would be strengthened in the 6 counties. So here you have Craig in a totally influential position, who is reshaping the outlines of partition in favour, as he sees it, of his own people in the north. He's consulted at every turn, and here you have the sectarian headcount, if you like, underpinning partition. He really didn't want the whole province, though it was offered to him. By March 1914, the British cabinet under Lloyd George had overturned the committee's recommendation. They had to keep their friends on board as well, when they obviously were facing massive opposition from Sinn Fein and indeed from the old Nationalist Party, which remained reasonably strong in Belfast. The next slide, please. Craig is a key figure here. Craig realised that it was make or break time. He realised that at this juncture, Ulster Unionism had their friends in power, and Lloyd George had very little wriggle room, even if he wanted to create a united Ireland, because the Tories had an outright majority. And so Craig went further. He realised that to defend the borders of this new entity called Northern Ireland, which would have 6 counties, places like South Armagh and Derry/Londonderry, he would need a reliable police force, and he gravely distrusted the mainly Catholic RIC. The upshot was, of course, that at a cabinet meeting in July, Craig argued for the placing of the Ulster Volunteers, returning from the front, on an official footing as an official police force, the Ulster Special Constabulary. And he won unexpected support from Winston Churchill, who was Secretary of State for War. Churchill said, let's arm the Protestants, his view being that this would free up troops and police for action against the IRA in the main theatre of war in the south. So the Ulster Special Constabulary were born. Obviously, they had to get this legislation through the House of Commons. where the Labour Party and the Liberal ex-Prime Minister Asquith were very much on guard against any enhancement of the Unionists in the north. So they called it a bill for special constables for Ireland, but it was really for Ulster. This was to be an exclusively Unionist force. It was recruited effectively in Orange Halls and among kind of returning soldiers from the Ulster Division. By 1922, the specials A, B, and C, A full-time, B part-time, C reserve, were 32,000 strong. And without that force really deployed along the new border in 1921 to 1922, the border couldn't have been drawn because the areas next to the border by and large were hostile to partition. So that's a key move. Craig does something else. Can we see the next slide, please? He realised, this is Walter Long, of course, the ex-Tory Chief Secretary for Ireland who chaired the Long Committee, just reminding us who he was. The next slide, please. Craig realised that there would have to be a midwife who would bring the new state into existence. He wanted a reliable, experienced senior official who had some experience of state building. And the British government suggested Sir Ernest Clark, an Englishman around 60, who had helped to create a government in South Africa, who had been in charge of the inland revenue, who had the vast kind of administrative experience necessary. And Craig insisted on an additional Undersecretary for Ireland. Now, they were usually sent to Dublin Castle, which was still operating. He wanted this Undersecretary sent to Belfast. So after genuflecting before the Chief Secretary in Dublin Castle, Sir Ernest Clark took the train north. He had an office adjoining Belfast City Hall, and as he said, he arrived with a stool, a chair, an Act of Parliament, but he was the man responsible for the creation of elections, a civil service, a separate judiciary, the rise of the Ulster Specials. And of course, the story goes that Craig had wanted someone who would be very devoted to the Ulster Unionist cause. And when he met Sir Ernest Clark, he said, to serve Ulster, Craig said, the word Ulster has to be graven on your heart. Clark replied, there's no room. The words England and Empire are already engraved in my heart. Craig said, you'll do. Now, of course, this man, Sir Ernest Clark, is there at a key time. He's raising effectively the specials as a sectarian force, but he's also dealing with the outworking of sectarian violence and work expulsions in the north. The next slide, please, because of course it's in July 1920 as the specials emerge and they're being recruited. Moving on to the next slide, please. It's in the summer of 1920 that serious sectarian violence erupts in Belfast. We'll just go back to the specials, please. And it erupts in Belfast. Several factors help to bring about that bloody summer, which sets the scene for the next 2 years. First of all, of course, the IRA campaign is gearing up in the north. IRA divisions are being organised from Belfast to Tyrone. Secondly, of course, the UVF are returning from the Western Front. In May, there's a civil war in Derry between parties of the UVF, returned from the war, and the IRA, who also include war veterans. 40 people are killed in that civil war in the northwest. The Nationalists have just won key councils like Fermanagh and Tyrone and Londonderry Corporation under PR. This is a challenge, if you like, to Craig's ongoing partition plans. Not only that, but Carson makes a speech in Belfast on the 12th of July 1920, in which, referring to the Sinn Fein electoral successes, he says, we will tolerate no Sinn Fein in Ulster. I will call out the UVF. At the same time, the IRA assassinate Lieutenant Colonel G.B. Smith from Banbridge, who is the senior police officer in Cork. His funeral is making its way north. Sectarian violence erupts in Banbridge, spreads to surrounding towns, and of course, the shipyard is closed for 2 weeks in July by tradition. It now employs about 20,000 men, 3,000 Catholics, the highest number ever employed. But sectarian violence breaks out on the 21st of July. Men tour the yard, all Sinn Feiners out, all Labourites out, the people who had supported the 44-hour weekend of strike the previous year. And soon you have 9,000 Catholics expelled from their work in Belfast, the Lurgan Valley, the Bann Valley. They become known as the expelled workers, and they become a cause célèbre. They're never really reinstated. And of course, as one Catholic businessman tells Churchill at this time, their existence is creating a ghetto among the Catholic minority, 25% in Belfast. The first killings occur in July. Soon you have 20 people killed. The IRA retaliate by bombing a shipyard trams. And soon we have 2 years of unremitting sectarian violence. The casual 450 people killed, nearly 60% of them from the Catholic community. Perhaps 10,000 people leave the city. The Irish government said 50,000 nationalists went south, and certainly several thousand, perhaps 5,000 unionists went north as a result of violence and intimidation at this time. The birth pangs of the new state. The next slide, please. It's against this background, if we move to the next slide, that elections are held in May 1921. Elections are set for both parts of Ireland. Sinn Fein used the elections in the south to create a new Dáil, a larger Dáil, and reject partition. In the north, the Unionists, of course, stand on the partition issue. De Valera and Devlin sign a pact by which they will transfer their votes to each other in that PR election. But in the end, it's a Unionist triumph. Craig gets a sort of a violent background, especially in Belfast. The Unionists win 40 of the 52 seats in the House of Commons. The Nationalists and Sinn Fein win 6 seats apiece. And of course, they declare their opposition to partition. They're going to boycott the new partition parliament. And indeed, Joe Devlin and the Nationalists from the north are not consulted about partition, whereas the Southern Unionists are. Devlin makes clear in the House of Commons, while he reviles partition, he sees certain safeguards as required. One is PR for all elections. Another is a weighted nationalist presence in the Northern Ireland Senate. In the south, Carson demands that for the Unionists, and they get 50% of the seats in the Dublin Senate until 1936. No such safeguards are granted in the north. So again, the Nationalists feeling very much out of it. And of course, it's announced that the King himself will come to open that parliament in state on the 22nd of June 1921, a day we marked last summer in various ways. But of course, the King is taking a risk coming to Belfast. He's preceded by perhaps 500 or 600 detectives and Secret Service agents. Large numbers of troops are sent to Balmoral from the south. The 10th Hussars act as the King's physical bodyguard on the occasion. The Queen is very worried about coming to a city which is a byword for sectarian violence. Churchill calls Belfast an underworld with violent passions of its own. But the King wants to make this a meaningful visit. He's concerned about the rising tide of reprisals in Ireland, about reports stating they may have to send in 200,000 troops and consider a series of concentration camps to defeat the IRA. The King thinks violence has gone too far. He meets the South African Prime Minister, General Smuts, a former rebel against the Crown in the Boer War. Smuts says, look, I'm in touch with De Valera. You have to use this speech to make a grandiloquent gesture. The King comes to Belfast. He's not talking to the Parliament in Belfast City Hall, that Unionist assembly, but he talks about calling on Irishmen to forgive and forget, to stretch out the hand of forbearance and conciliation, and to seek for the land that they love, whether under one Parliament or two, as Irishmen may themselves decide, a new era of peace, contentment and goodwill. Within days, a truce is arranged between the IRA and British forces. Within a couple of weeks, De Valera is in London negotiating with Lloyd George, and the scene is set for the treaty negotiations of December 1921. But Craig has now got his parliament. His slogan becomes, what we have, we hold. And can we see, is there another slide, please? Have we another slide? The IRA campaign, of course, does not end in the north. Sectarian violence continues, and in fact, the King's Honour Guard leaving Belfast is actually derailed in South Armagh. Large numbers of horses and 4 troops are killed. The King talks about this brutal outrage, but this is a reminder on the South Armagh new border with County Louth that, in fact, the partition issue is not going to go away. The next slide, please, if there is one. And of course, Michael Collins comes north as Minister of Finance, elected for County Armagh. De Valera is elected for County Down. They don't take their seats in Belfast, but Collins speaks in Armagh in September. "We will not desert you," he tells 20,000 people, and reviews a march past of the IRA in Armagh City. But in the negotiations, the North is very much secondary to national status. Instead of a united Ireland, which was Sinn Féin's aim, they achieve a boundary commission, rather half-baked, rather elusive. And of course, by 1925, the boundary commission will collapse. By then, Collins is dead, Griffith is dead, Lloyd George is out of office. And of course, after another year of violence north of the new border and a civil war to the south, two Irish states will emerge with a hard border by 1925. Thank you very much.